Hi, and welcome to AWP's Career Services web series. This presentation is on letters of recommendation. My name is Cathy Day, and I guess first you might want to know, well, who am I to tell you anything about this crazy thing that we do called writing letters of recommendation? Well, the answer to that is that as a faculty mentor, I have written a lot of these for my students over the years. I also, as a member of many search committees, I have read and discussed a lot of these things from candidates. And as someone who has had 4 tenure track jobs, it's a long story. I have had to ask a lot of people to write these things for me. So I feel like I got my MFA in 1995, and I've been on the job market or in academia ever since. And so I feel like I'm drawing upon all of my own experiences from all different sides of this into this presentation for you today. The format. Feel free to pause and take notes as I'm talking. There's a lot more text in here than I would use if I was just giving this talk in front of an audience. And it's because I know that you probably want to stop and write a lot of things down, so feel free to do that. I'm first going to talk about, just try to put it in context, what is a letter of recommendation. I'm going to try to show you how to ask for a letter, give you some advice on working with the people who write the letters for you so that they can help you to the best of their ability, and also dealing with the paperwork. It's a very complicated process, so hopefully some of the things that I say will help you with that. From time to time, I'm going to pause and stop, and I'm going to give you a pro tip. And these are in orange, and I hope that these are just really quick bits of advice that hit home for you. So let's get started. Here's the first pro tip. Now, you cannot put somebody on your curriculum vitae as a letter of recommendation writer, an LOR writer, unless you have talked to them and made sure that they are willing. I actually had this happen to me just the other day. I got a letter from a school, an email from a school saying so-and-so has asked you to send a letter for them because they're applying for a job here, and it was actually somebody that I didn't really know very well, and I didn't really feel like I could write a good letter for them. So that was very awkward for the candidate, awkward for me, and not a good thing. So just know, in case you didn't already know that you're not supposed to put somebody down unless you've talked to them and made sure that that's something that they are willing to do. So let's first talk about where a letter of recommendation falls in the whole job application package. So the most important part of the package is your curriculum vitae, your academic resume. Probably the second most important part of the job application package is your letter of recommendation, the letter that you write, which is basically a very good essay and an argument about why you are a good candidate for their position. Then there comes the letters of recommendation, academic transcripts, a teaching portfolio is often a part of the package, and usually a writing sample. Now the thing is, and I'm not going to talk about those other aspects of the package, just the letters of recommendation. Now, some schools will only ask for the vita and the letter up front, and then screen candidates, and then from those candidates ask for the rest of those materials. Some schools will ask for them right up front. You actually don't know. Or they might even just ask for the whole kit and caboodle from the very beginning. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I actually had somebody just the other day who said, well, I'm not going to secure letters of recommendation. I'm not going to secure letter writers until I find out if they were applying for a job like this. And they were going to wait to see if they got to the next round before they asked people for letters. And the reason that that's a mistake is that sometimes a school might say, we need this letter in 2 weeks. And you can't give somebody just 2 weeks to write a letter. And so one of my pieces of advice is that you should not wait to see if you make it to the second round before securing these things. It is a huge imposition on someone to ask for a letter of recommendation at the last minute. And by last minute, I mean a week, 2 weeks, even 3 weeks is kind of last minute. I'll talk about that in a little bit. I think I'd like to begin by just trying to put letters of recommendation in a bigger context for you. So let's talk about some essential questions that I think you might have. And the first one is why do I need this crazy thing? Why do we go to all this trouble to get letters of recommendation? And the answer to that is that this goes way back to previous centuries, is that we have always needed some kind of letter of introduction. We've always needed people to introduce us to other people that or organizations that we want to be a part of. And here's a good example. So Ernest Hemingway, he's getting ready to move to Paris, and he really wants to hang out with Gertrude Stein. He really wants to go to her salon, and this is really important to him. So he asks his friend Sherwood Anderson, who's been kind of a mentor to him. He's like, hey, would you write me a letter of introduction so that I can't just, show up at Gertrude Stein's house and join her salon? So Sherwood Anderson does this, and that's how he got to meet Gertrude Stein, thankfully. It's just so sad, because after doing that solid for Hemingway really kind of trashed him later. But that's another story. In this analogy, you are Hemingway, and the MFA program that you want to get into is Gertrude Stein, and the letter of recommendation writer is Sherwood Anderson. So basically, you need to get somebody like Sherwood Anderson to help you get into a salon. It's a pretty good analogy. Another reason that you need them is that we have always needed people to vouch for us in the vetting process. Most of us think of the word vetting in terms of candidates, that we vet candidates to see if they are appropriate for a job, for example, to see if they're up to snuff. But the actual source of the term comes from this. It comes from veterinarian, and it comes from horse racing. In order for a horse to be cleared to race, it must be vetted. It must be examined by a vet. And in this analogy, let's see, you are the horse, and the letter of recommendation writer is the veterinarian, and I guess the race is the MFA program. Why do you need an LOR? Number 3, because they allow employers to understand who you are off the page. In most job searches outside of the academy, there's usually like a 2 to 3 minute, maybe 10-minute interview that you might have with a employer to just kind of get the feel for who you are and do that right up front. Well, we don't actually do that till the very end of the process. So that is why letters of recommendation are like the one piece of information that an employer, a school is getting about who you are, that it's not you telling them, it's about somebody else saying what you're like as a person, not as words on a page. So that's another reason why they're so important. And just basically, this is what it means to be a credentialed professional, that you are always in the process of finding people who will vouch for you professionally. That's just part of your job. So here's another pro tip for you. It is okay to use letters of recommendation from people who are outside the academy, such as an agent or an editor, if that is necessary. This is a question that comes up a lot for people, I think. And there are situations in which this happens that I think are really important to talk about. I asked a couple of my friends, for example, David Haynes, a fiction writer who teaches at Southern Methodist and is a former AWP board member, or he is an AWP board member right now. And he said to me about this, he said, you're putting together the strongest story that you can about yourself, and that story might best be told by someone outside the academy. It depends on the job and the story being told. And I can think of a really good example. Let's say that you're being hired to teach at a school where you're also going to be, say, running their university press poetry series, for example. And that's a situation where if you had a letter about your organizational skills or your administrative skills that came from outside the academy, that might actually be really helpful for a job. But if you're applying for a straight teaching position, a letter from the person that used to supervise you or in an administrative capacity might not be the best person. So it really does depend on the job. My friend Rick Robbins, a poet who teaches at Minnesota State University, Mankato, the first person to hire me, by the way, and a former AWP board member, said this piece of advice. He said, you have to consider the package of letters of recommendation that you're submitting. An editor or an agent could speak to your writing in great detail, but they can't say really anything about your teaching. That would fall to someone else. The breadth and depth of views in the package of letters of recommendation is what's important. And you really do have to tailor it depending on what kind of job that you're applying for. So that's good advice too. So when will you need a letter of recommendation? One good reason to get these things is that it's not just the academic job search in which you'll need these things. You're also going to need them if you do get the job when you go through the tenure and promotion process. You often need letters of recommendation when you do non-academic job searches. You need it especially if you want to go to conferences and colonies and residencies, whether or not you teach in academia or not. These are good things to go to, and a lot of them you can't get in unless somebody vouches for you. You need them for many fellowships and grants. I often end up writing a kind of version of a letter of recommendation when I'm referring people to my agent or to editors that I know. And for a lot of prizes and awards, you need letters of recommendation. So this is something, whether even if you're watching this and you have no desire to go on the academic job market, there are still plenty of good reasons to get letters of recommendation for yourself and to have them on file. Okay, here's another pro tip. You must make sure that your mentors or your supervisors are in a position to talk about your writing, your teaching, and your service. And when I say supervisors, I mean, let's say that you've been teaching as an adjunct or in a non-tenure track position for a while, and you are trying to get a letter from somebody in the place where you're currently working. You need to try as much as possible to find people that can talk about your writing, your publications, your scholarship, your teaching, and your service. Those are the three cornerstones of academic life. Now the thing is that you must take the initiative to get letters of recommendation. People may not offer to watch you teach. You may teach at a place where nobody is necessarily supervising you. You may be at an MFA program where maybe the writing program, if you're teaching composition, observes you teaching, but your mentor or nobody from the creative writing program is watching you teach. Now here's the deal. A lot of people, I think, feel that this is a slight somehow, but this is welcome to the real world. I mean, if you want these things, you must take the initiative to reach out to people and set up those things. You cannot always sit back and think that somebody is supposed to come to you and offer to do these things for you. You have to take that initiative. MFA faculty, I mean, they're very busy, and they might sometimes be making themselves scarce to finish a book. Don't be deterred. Just because they're hard to reach doesn't necessarily mean that they won't help you. All MFA faculty know that this is an important part of their job. So you might just have to be a little bit persistent. But I've never known a situation where somebody asked for somebody to watch them teach or to write them a letter if it was their job and they didn't do it. So when should you start thinking about this? Definitely while you're an MFA student, you need to be thinking about this. And then I would say also, if you are in a kind of first job where you're not on the tenure track yet, you also need to be thinking about getting a letter of recommendation from that institution as well. Because the questions, who will I ask for a letter, and what will my teachers and or supervisors or colleagues say about me, should inform the choices that you make in graduate school about what courses to take, the performance, how you do in those classes, whether you're being impressive and memorable or whether you're not. All of that is really important, and you should start thinking about it actually at the beginning of your time in an institution. You need to evaluate a professor's discipline, their genre, their aesthetic, their reputation. For example, let's say that you are interested in jobs that might enable you to teach both creative writing and composition. Well, then you'd better figure out a way to get a letter from somebody in the composition field by taking a class with them, by working with them somehow. That's something that you have to figure out. You really need to, choose your mentors as wisely as possible and just make sure that you have them watch you teach, make sure that they are informed about who you are before they write your letters. Another pro tip, even if you are not sure whether or not you ever want to go on the academic job market, do not leave graduate school without securing some letters of recommendation. One of the reasons for that is that the best time to write a letter about someone is when you're directing their thesis, not 3 years later. When I've been working with somebody on their thesis and I've had them in class, they are fresh in my mind, and it's very easy for me to write a letter for them, even if it's just a rough draft at that point. If they come to me 3 years later and say, I'm ready now, I honestly, like, you have forgotten a lot. So it might be a good idea to ask for a draft of the letter even when you're in school, just in case. If you are out of school, you've been out of school for a while, for example, you've been out of academia. I actually had I had an email just the other day from a friend of mine who's been out of the academic world for a while, but is trying to sort of get back in. These are some people that you can ask to write letters for you. You can ask editors who have published your work to speak on your behalf. This is especially good. Go to a conference or a colony that includes an author reading your work. It might cost a little bit more, it might be harder to get in, but pretty much once an author has read your work, at least a substantial amount of it, they're usually in a position to speak to it. Maybe they can't speak to your teaching, but they can speak to your writing. Another thing you can do is to take a class, maybe locally. Maybe there's a local college or a writing center where you can take a class, or you could offer to teach a class, either at an independent literary center or at a community college or a local college, and that will allow someone to be able to speak on your behalf. You can ask your agent if you have one. You can ask someone to speak to your teaching ability and your collegiality, who maybe is somebody that you've worked with in any kind of professional capacity. And you can always ask your teachers, even if it's been a while. I still write letters for people that I had in class like 10 years ago. Of course, as long as they're not dead, they can still write you a letter. Even if they're retired, they can write you a letter. And even if they've started teaching at a different school, they can still write on your behalf. And this is a good question, but what if I am already in a tenure track position? How do you get letters when you maybe don't necessarily want the people where you are to know that you're on the market? Well, and I've been in this position a couple of times. A good choice is to ask former colleagues, maybe somebody that you used to work with but has since moved on, because they've seen you in action, but they are no longer they're no longer employed by the same employer, and so they maybe they're not necessarily going to let the cat out of the bag. You could ask colleagues in other departments, maybe colleagues that you've worked with on a committee or in some other kind of professional capacity. You can ask writer teachers that are familiar with your work, people that you've developed professional relationships with, people that you've been on panels with, say at AWP, or that you've worked with judging a contest or something like that. And also editors and agents can also speak on your behalf. Now, this is the thing that I think is really important, is that you need to remember that it is your responsibility, whether you're in school, out of school, been out of school for a long time, whether you've been in your current job for, say, I don't know, 10 years, and you decide that you want to go on the market, and you ask yourself, who do I know? That's the thing, is that to be a professional means that knowing people becomes part of your job. And I think that that's a really good thing to remember, that even if you are in a place for a long time, that you still need to be keeping your eye on developing professional relationships with people outside of the place where you're employed. And here's another good question. But what if I have a letter from a famous writer and she dies? Haha. Well, the thing is that schools have to be able to check your references, and they cannot use a Ouija board to accomplish this task. So unfortunately, every school I've ever worked at, before they can hire you, they have to call all your references and get verbal confirmation of the letter of recommendation. And obviously, if the person is dead, they can't get that. I would say that if somebody just recently died and it's only been like a year, that you could probably use the letter. But after that, you probably just need to take that letter from the famous writer and frame it and put it on your wall, because you're not going to be able to use it for the job market anymore, unfortunately. So let's go to part 2, and that is like how to literally ask for a letter from somebody. Okay, so the ask. The very first thing is that you want to send an email to their edu or some other official address. Not Facebook, not Twitter, If you want to go old school and actually mail a letter, this is a formal request and you need to treat it as such. Like 10 or 15 years ago, people wouldn't have said send an email, but that's about as formal as we can get these days. You can ask in person, but I would only ask in person if you're reasonably sure that they're going to say yes, such as if they're your thesis director. Set up a meeting, and it could be about your thesis, or it could be just about going on the job market, and say I'm planning to apply for academic positions, and I hope you can write a letter on my behalf. Don't just assume they will. You should always ask, even if you think they're going to say yes. And remember that you need to secure your letter writers a few months before the job search begins. Here's the things that I would put in the email letter that you send. Just say hello and get to the point of the message. I can't tell you the number of times that I've received like 3 a.m. angsty, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? And blah, 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 blah. And here's this, and I got this going on. And then at the end of all this, they're like, will you write me a letter of recommendation for the job market? So I would just suggest getting to the point as quickly as possible. If it's been a while, remind them of who you are. If it's been a while since you graduated, include where you are with your current writing project. I really believe that the strongest time for you to go on the job market is when you have a book that's either getting ready to come out or has just come out. And so you probably want to tell your letter writer where you are so that they can definitely include that in how they talk about you in their letter. You might want to mention why you're going on the market. You might want to talk about where you're planning to apply, and then close. Now the thing is that you might want to hold back on saying why you're going on the market, especially if you have a tenure track job and you're going on the market, because maybe you want to wait to see if the person says yes before you start announcing to people that you're going on the market, because it's a small world. So here's the possible responses. The best response, of course, is yes, I would love to write you a letter. And they might say, well, let me think about it. And that's still not, at least in my world, that's still not a no. They might ask more questions. I often do that. They might say, well, I don't know if I'm really the best person. Maybe you should ask so-and-so. They might say, I'm really sorry, but I'm busy, that's a no. They might say, I'm so sorry, but no, I'm not going to. And that's a no. Or they might not answer, which seems like definitely a no unless your email just happened to get lost in their inbox, which is sometimes a problem. But for some people, I don't know, we live in a world where people don't answer, and that's supposed to mean no. So how are you supposed to know what things mean? Because the truth is that for me, the only real no is I'm so sorry, but no. If I say I'm so sorry, but I'm busy, I'm not trying to be polite and let you down easy. I often mean, well, I can't do it right now, but maybe I'll do it later. And I've had students, like I've said, I'm sorry, but I'm busy right now. Can I do it next year? And then they never ask me again because they think that I'm just being nice. But then there are people that pretty much everything other than yes, of course, means no to them. And I can't tell you how you're supposed to necessarily know what the answer is, other than you're just going to have to use the context of the situation to the best of your ability to figure out, what are they really trying to say. But really the only thing that matters is that if they say no, I can't write you a letter for any reason, you just really need to move on gracefully. Please don't dwell. Please don't try to figure out why is it that they're not writing a letter for me. You'll drive yourself crazy. It's a very normal part of the writing world to ask people for favors and to be turned down for those favors. And you just really can't let yourself dwell on it, or you'll just drive yourself nuts. Now, what happens if the letter writer says, I will write the letter for you, and then why don't you write the letter for me and I'll just sign it? Is that okay? And the answer is no, that is not okay. This letter is a confidential document, and it must be written by the letter of recommendation writer. If somebody asks you to do that, I would recommend that they are not a good letter writer, and you probably just want to avoid that person, avoid asking that person. Another pro tip, your application is confidential. No one at the school to which you apply can talk about your application or share information publicly. And what I mean by that is that especially if you currently have a job and you are going on the market, you should feel that nobody at, like, let's say you're at school A and you're applying at school B, you should feel confident that nobody at school B is going to like know somebody at school A and tell them that you're on the market. They should not do that. You should feel confident. I can't say that it never happens, but that's not the way it's supposed to happen. Most schools have confidentiality rules and legal rules that say that you're not even really, people on a search committee aren't even really allowed to talk about the search outside the search room, let alone publicly. And definitely not on social media. They're not allowed to say things like, boy, we're running a search this year, and boy, did we sure get a lot of applications from such and such school or whatever. They're not allowed to do those things. And certainly, if you are ever on a search committee, do not ever say anything on social media or in person about any candidate, even if it's positive, and certainly nothing negative. You just kind of have to pretend that it's sort of not happening, the whole search. So just remember that. You cannot write the letter for somebody, but many faculty will want you to provide them some information up front because they want to represent you as well as possible. So I got a lot of this from Denty Moore, who is a creative nonfiction writer at Ohio University, and he's a former AWP board member. And this is what he basically sends to anybody who says, will you write me a letter? And this is what he asks them to provide. He says, okay, I want you to tell me about your goals. I want you to clarify exactly what kinds of jobs you're applying for. And the reason that's important is that if you are applying to all small liberal arts colleges, that's what you really want. Well, then that's a very different kind of letter because you're probably going to talk about somebody's teaching more than somebody who has to teach in an MFA program at a Research One, which means that they just want the 2-2 load. And so the most important thing is not necessarily the teaching, but the quality of the writing and your prestige. So that's really important for the letter writer to know what it is that your ultimate goal is. And let's say your goal is that you want to teach lit or composition, or you want to have nothing but all creative writing. All of those things might require that they pitch you in a different way. And a letter that covers all of those eventualities is yet another sort of letter. The truth is, and this is another pro tip, most likely whoever writes your letter, they're only going to write one letter, not letters tailored to each position. Although there might be very nice people who take the template, the blueprint of the letter that they write for you, and say you're applying to, like I went to DePaul University, you're applying to a small liberal arts college, and they literally take your letter and they pitch it directly to that kind of school. And then you're also applying to, I used to teach at the University of Pittsburgh, and then they take that letter and they say, okay, I'm going to put the research first, and I'm going to talk about what a great colleague they'd be in an MFA program, versus another letter where they just talked about how you would be with undergraduates only. So some people might be willing to do that, but more than likely they're going to write one letter and they're going to talk about all those eventualities. The only time I ever asked for individual letters was the year I only applied for 2 jobs, because it just takes so much time out of somebody's life to tailor the letters that way, especially if you're applying for like 10, 15, 20 jobs. That can take somebody forever. You want to be sure to tell them about your publications. Now, you are going to give them your CV, and so they're going to see all your past pubs, but they may not necessarily know what all your future pubs are, things that are maybe forthcoming, or book projects, all your irons in the fire. I know it's on your CV, but your letter of recommendation writer is a human being, and we want you to highlight what you think we should highlight in our letters. It's totally fine. Don't think that you're insulting our intelligence by highlighting things and telling us what you would like us to point out. You also want them to talk about your teaching, and you want to tell them, have you won any awards, courses that you've taught, any honors or unexpected results, if there's a unique approach or a unique class that you offer. And remember, if they have watched you teach, that letter of recommendation is going to be so much more persuasive. I can't tell you how much more reassuring it is if you're on a search committee to read a letter by somebody who's actually been in the room when you taught a class. That is the most persuasive kind of letter that you can possibly have. Okay, so then you want them to talk about your scholarship, and you're thinking, what, did I get a scholarship to go to this college? No, I'm not talking about that. Scholarship is one of those cornerstones of academic life. You may not think about what you do as scholarship, however, but it's important that you remember that for now at least, the default of most English departments is set up for those who have PhDs in literature and composition, and those folks do call what they do scholarship, and that you will be evaluated for promotion and tenure in a system that is set to that default. I always liken it to, as a woman back when, we use the pronoun he to talk about both men and women. I was supposed to just assume that the he meant me too. I guess that's, as a creative writer, that often is what it feels like in an English department, that the umbrella of scholarship is supposed to encompass also what it is that we do. Scholarship is about peer-reviewed scholarship, and we do editorial review of our work. So it is a little bit different. So you might want to, remembering that there might be people outside of creative writing who do consider themselves scholars on the search committee, you might want to make sure your letter writer stresses, in addition to your creative work, maybe you've done some conference presentations, maybe you did some non-MFA coursework, maybe you need to have them explain what your publications mean in our field, since their benchmarks are different than ours. You might want to have somebody explain what your publications mean, especially if they're in online magazines or in smaller magazines or experimental magazines. Now you also want to make sure that they maybe talk about what kind of colleague or departmental citizen that you could potentially be. Did you read for a literary magazine when you were in school? Did you serve on committees? Did you organize a reading series? Did you do something not related to creative writing that demonstrates that you'd be a good colleague or a stronger teacher? If there's something like, let's say you've been in a first job for a while as an adjunct or as a non-tenure track faculty member, and there was something that you made happen while you were there as a colleague, that's something that you would definitely want them to stress when they write your letter for you. Or if you were an advocate or a volunteer in some way, that's also a really good thing to mention. So here's another pro tip. If you already have a tenure track job, the job search committee is going to wonder why you are applying for their position. They are going to wonder, like, what's the real story here? And so it's never ever a good idea to diss your current employer, not in your letter of application and not in any kind of exchange that you have with them. So you probably want to let the letter of recommendation writer or writers tactfully reveal what your real motivation is. This is usually where you're able to find out, like, is this a thing with a spouse? Is this a thing that there's in a dysfunctional department? What's the source of their dissatisfaction? Is there something about this region that particularly appeals to this person? But you don't want to tell the letter of recommendation writer what to say. Just trust that if they've ever been on a search committee, they know what the right thing to say is, and just let them say it. So now let's talk about paperwork and bureaucracy. Ugh, so much of that. If your letter writer has an academic position, always use that email address on your CV and when you contact the dossier service. For example, I have both a cathyday.com address and a bsu.edu address. So you definitely want to use my BSU one, because the whole point of this, if this is an academic job application that you're making, you want to stress that you're getting a letter of recommendation from somebody who has an academic job. So definitely do that. You want to be organized on behalf of your letter writers. Put everything that they need to write your letter in one email or one envelope. I write so many letters every fall and spring, and it's just, if people are sending me things piecemeal, it's just so hard to keep track of. Make sure that we know exactly where you need us to send the letter. I mean, honestly, if you could give us the self-addressed, if it has to go in the mail, the self-addressed stamped envelope would also be really helpful. I've known people who didn't get letters sent in time because somebody couldn't find a stamp. So if you take care of that, you're going to be better off. Make everything as clear as you possibly can. And remember that they need all of this at least 1 month before the first due date, because quite honestly, it takes me at least 2 hours to write a good letter of recommendation. Maybe even more if I have to reread their work or look over teaching evaluations. After the first time I write a letter, it's relatively easy to update and tweak. I just did that the other day. I was able to take an old letter and I spent about 15, 20 minutes kind of saying it's been about 2 years and here's where this person is now. That's a little bit different. Here you go. It's that first time that's really the hardest and takes the most time. And the reason that you need to give us a month is that you need to put yourself in somebody's queue. Um, I know that I have about 4 letters to write this fall because most of the people who asked me to write letters for them asked me in August. And so I knew that there was only a certain amount of stuff I should say yes to around this time. I can't really fit in a letter in a short amount of time. So that's why you need to give us at least a month. You might want to create a spreadsheet for your letter writers, detailing what job it is, the deadline, like the contact email, or maybe a website if they want to look something up, address, who they should address it to, the description of the position, if there's any additional info or ideas about tailoring the letter, that's a good place to put it. Send that to us. And then they're going to say, what's my deadline? Okay, so here's how you figure out your deadline. It's really simple. So let's say that somebody's applying to all these schools: Middle California, Upper Peninsula College, Craggy Mountain, Central Flyover State, Top Lofty College, Sierra Community College, and the College of Privilege. And these are all the due dates. The only due date that matters, and which is the due date for your letter writers, is the first due date. Because that's when you have to have a letter written by, and after that it's relatively easy to send that letter to the other schools. So it's only the first deadline that really matters. I think sometimes people forget that. That's really the only one that really matters. And about a week before that first deadline, I highly recommend that you send a gentle reminder to your letters of recommendation writers, reminding them that the due date is approaching and you are not bugging them. I actually had this happen this week. I had a student who asked me in August if I would write a letter, and I said sure, and then I forgot about it and he didn't remind me, and maybe he just thought that that would be insulting to remind me, but oh my God, no. I was about a day late. I don't think it made that much of a difference, but I felt really bad about it. You are not bugging your letter writers to send them a gentle reminder. And yes, Virginia, you do need a dossier service. There's a couple good reasons. I need to have a place to send your letter that's secure and confidential. I can't send it to you. You're not supposed to see it. So I need to send it to someplace secure. And we'll talk in a minute about why you don't want that to necessarily be the school itself. You need a dossier service to send these letters to various committees and competitions. Especially early in your career, you're applying to so many things. And the dossier service is like a place where you can have your work, have these letters, and you can pick and choose where the different places are that it's going to. You cannot, especially when you're asking for lots of letters to go to lots of places, you cannot bug your letter of recommendation writer every time you need a letter. What you need to do is you need to get your letters from the writers like in the fall, like ask in the summer, get it in the fall, put it in the dossier service, and don't bug us again about this stuff. If you need one letter that's for academic positions that talks about teaching, writing, and service, great. If you need another one that's for competitions and committees like fellowship stuff and it needs to just talk about your writing, have us send 2 versions, one for teaching and one for fellowships. Put them both in the dossier service, and then you don't have to bug us every time. The nice thing about this also is that if I go on vacation or I'm out of touch or I get an operation, you don't have to worry about needing it really fast and not being able to reach me. You're going to need letters for quite a long time as you begin a career, so it's just, you might as well go ahead and start using a dossier service to start keeping track of all this stuff. I would recommend that you use Interfolio. As far as I know, it's the most used online dossier service. It's most used by both people in English departments, AWP, and also MLA use it. And Interfolio has something called by committee, which means that you can submit the letter of recommendation digitally, and then it gets delivered digitally to the school as well. If the school doesn't use by committee, then you might have to pay for postal mailings or digital mailings if they don't use that, but pretty much it can all happen digitally. I would also recommend that you just remember that you always have to check the box that says that you waive your right to see the letter. The reason this is important is that if you do not waive your right, then that means that you can see the letter. And that means that the person who wrote the letter wrote it knowing that you could see it, which means that they probably pulled punches. And so most committees won't really seriously consider a letter that says that you've waived your right to see it. Another pro tip before I forget is that most people, if you ask them to write you a letter and they know that they would write a mixed letter or a bad letter, most of them will say, no, I don't want to write, you should ask somebody else. You don't want a mixed letter or a bad letter in your file. But there are also some people that would just go ahead and write the bad letter anyway. So just know that most people I know don't do that. But that is actually something that I recommend that you talk to a mentor about if you're in a program about how they can help you perhaps find out if you do have a letter like that in your file. Hopefully you know the people that you write letters for you well enough that that would not happen. So I hope that you found the information in here helpful. Oh my God, if only I had known these things when I was first starting out. I've learned all these things the hard way over the last 20 years. I hope that you will tell people about this. I hope you'll tell AWP at AWP Writer. Say something on Twitter, say something to me, and tell other people because AWP would really like this to help lots of people make the most of the academic job market for creative writers. So thanks a lot for listening and good luck in your search.